Better sentences, variety, fragments, run-ons, and comma splices. Sentence types. Let's start with simple sentences. Simple sentences contain one independent clause. Notice this sentence. Today is a day of mourning and remembering. Now, even though we see the word and, the and is part of the prepositional phrase. But let's look at the beginning of the sentence. Today is. Those are the subject and verb of this sentence and the only subject and verb in this sentence. So this is a simple sentence. Simple sentences may have more than one subject or more than one verb. Look at this sentence. Nancy and I are pained to the core. Here we have Nancy and I. That's two subjects, but we still only have one verb. So there's only one set of subject-verb, but this one has two subjects and one verb. Look at this sentence. They overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. Here, they is the subject of this simple sentence, and we have two verbs, overcame and did. So even with two subjects and one verb, or one subject and two verbs, both of these are simple sentences. Another kind of sentence type is a compound sentence. Compound sentences contain two or more independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction. And again, an independent clause is really just a simple sentence. So it's two simple sentences or two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction, such as for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so. Compound sentences have at least two subject-verb combinations. And both of the clauses are equal in importance. Look at this sentence. We feel your loss and we're thinking about you so very much. We have two independent clauses, which could be simple sentences. We feel your loss and we're thinking about you so very much. So the first independent clause is we feel your loss, and the second one is we're thinking about you so very much. And they are joined by the coordinating conjunction and. So we see two sets of subjects and verbs. We feel and we're thinking. And both of those sentences are equally important. Look at this sentence. It's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. Again, we have two independent clauses. It's hard to understand, and sometimes painful things like this happen. This time we have the coordinating conjunction but, which gives the opposite meaning of and. And we have our two subject-verb combinations. It's, which is really it is, and things happen. And both of these clauses have equal importance. Another type of sentence is a complex sentence. Complex sentences have one independent clause and one dependent clause joined by a subordinating conjunction. So an independent clause is really just a simple sentence, and a dependent clause has a subordinating conjunction before it. Subordinating conjunctions are words such as when, although, if, as, when, because, where, and many others. Notice this sentence. Several school children were watching on TV when the disaster happened. We have several school children were watching on TV, which is the independent clause. And then we have our subordinating conjunction when, and that signals that what follows is connected to the word when. So that is the dependent clause, when the disaster happened. Complex sentences have an independent clause that has more importance than the dependent clause. So in the sentence above, several school children were watching on TV is more important than when the disaster happened. In addition, I can just say several school children were watching on TV and place a period there. But I can't say when the disaster happened, period. Notice this sentence. After the spacecraft lifted off, a failure caused it to disintegrate. So this is also a complex sentence. We have our subordinating conjunction, after, so that tells us that what comes after it is the subordinating conjunction, after the spacecraft lifted off. Now we can't put a period there, so we put a comma. And then we have a failure caused it to disintegrate. That would be complete by itself. So that is the independent clause, and it's more important than the dependent clause. Notice that I have switched the order of where the subordinating conjunction goes. You have two choices when you write complex sentences, and that can help you with sentence variety in your writing. So with complex sentences, we can have the subject and verb, and then the subordinating conjunction, and then the other subject and verb, and the period. Or we can take that dependent clause and put it at the beginning of the entire complex sentence and have your subordinating conjunction, subject verb, comma, subject verb, period. Notice that there is no comma in the first type of sentence, and there is a comma in the second type of sentence. So looking at the sentences on the screen, we have several school children were watching on TV when the disaster happened, period. We do not have a comma before when, because we don't usually put commas before our dependent clauses. However, if we have a sentence such as the other sentence, after the spacecraft lifted off, a failure caused it to disintegrate, we need a comma after the dependent clause. So we have after the spacecraft lifted off, comma, a failure caused it to disintegrate. You will probably enjoy writing more and find your writing to be better if you vary your sentence structure and length. For instance, if you write an essay and you only use simple sentences, it will sound like you're just shooting them out like bullets. If you only write compound sentences, it'll sound like you're just rocking back and forth, and the reader may fall asleep. If you only use complex sentences, it's a bit more sophisticated, but if you use the same structure, it could still get very boring. What you want to do is you want to use all of those sentence structures, and even within those, you can have different lengths. You can begin sentences with prepositional phrases instead of putting the subject first. Look at this simple sentence. For 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. This is a simple sentence. I could have written, the United States space program has been doing just that for 25 years. That's one option. But if you want to switch it up, sometimes you can put the prepositional phrase at the beginning. So here the prepositional phrase is for 25 years. Again, sometimes you can do that, and then other times you might want to change it and go ahead and put that prepositional phrase at the end of the sentence or somewhere else where it belongs. You can also use a combination of simple, compound, and complex sentences. Notice this short paragraph. Christy McCullough was a high school teacher. She was not an astronaut, but she had special training to go on the mission. People were very sad because she would have been the first teacher in space. So here I have Christy McCullough was a high school teacher. That is a simple sentence, and simple sentences are good, they're fine. We also have, she was not an astronaut, but she had special training to go on the mission. Again, this is a compound sentence, and it's just fine. People were very sad because she would have been the first teacher in space. And here we have our complex sentence, which is also fine. And if we switch them up and use them together, our writing just sounds more sophisticated and interesting to the reader. So you can intersperse, which just means mix, short, simple sentences with longer, more complex ones. Now this means longer, even simple sentences. You can use phrases in simple sentences to accomplish this. Notice this simple sentence. Sadly, they all died. And here's another simple sentence. Their tragic deaths were commemorated on television in a speech by the president. These are both simple sentences. Notice that the first simple sentence is very short. Sadly, they all died. And it's okay to have short sentences from time to time because sometimes they have impact when they're in the middle of longer sentences. And then we have their tragic deaths were commemorated on television in a speech by the president. And this sentence adds more information. This really just means deaths were. And then we have the phrases on television, in a speech, by the president. So I've added on to my simple sentence, and I have two simple sentences together which sound nice because they have variety. You can also use modifiers or appositives in simple sentences. Modifiers is just a fancy word for things like adjectives, adverbs, or adjective clauses or adverb clauses. And a positive is a type of noun phrase that describes another noun in a sentence. Look at this sentence. Krista McCullough, a high school teacher, was from New Hampshire. Here we have the main subject, Krista McCullough, which is actually the only subject. So this is a simple sentence with a single verb was. The phrase a high school teacher is an appositive that describes who Krista McCullough was. And notice that teacher is a noun. So it is a noun phrase describing another noun, Krista McCullough, in this sentence. You can also convert compound sentences into complex ones if you find that you're writing too many compound sentences. Notice this sentence. They died and the space program was put on hold. You can write that another way and convert it into a complex sentence simply by changing a word and the punctuation. The space program was put on hold after they died. So that's another trick for sentence variety. Now let's talk about some errors. The run-on or fused sentences. So a run-on is not just a long sentence. A run-on is when you have two independent clauses or more that don't have anything separating them. Look at this sentence. Michael Smith was the pilot. He had a great deal of experience. Well, you as the writer might know to take a pause between the two clauses. Michael Smith was the pilot. He had a great deal of experience. But the reader doesn't know ahead of time what you're trying to say. So in the reader's mind, this is difficult to read. We need to take the subject and verb and the other subject and verb and separate those two independent clauses. So Michael Smith was the pilot is separate from he had a great deal of experience. So what we're looking at on the screen is a run-on sentence. And teachers do not like those. And readers do not like those either because it makes it very hard to read. Now I'm going to correct that simply with a period. That's one choice. I can say Michael Smith was the pilot, period. He had a great deal of experience, and that's fine. Again, if you think about sentence variety, that is one option to have two simple sentences. Another thing you can do is correct a run-on with semicolons. Look at this. Michael Smith was the pilot, semicolon. He had a great deal of experience, period. So a semicolon in this case acts just like a period, but very often if you have a run-on, to fix it, a semicolon might be closer to what you mean because it means those two sentences are really related to each other. You can also put in a coordinating conjunction as long as you have that comma before it. Michael Smith was the pilot, comma, and he had a great deal of experience. So those are the three usual ways of fixing a run-on sentence. Now we go to comma splices. A lot of people are confused by comma splices. Comma splices are just a type of run-on. So let's look at our run-on. Michael Smith was the pilot. He had a great deal of experience. We already know that this is bad. Teachers don't like it. Readers don't like it. So you might be tempted, or just naturally, you might put in a comma. Michael Smith was the pilot, comma, he had a great deal of experience. This is a comma splice. It is bad. It is just as bad as a run-on, but it's a little easier to fix. So notice we have the independent clause, Michael Smith was the pilot, and then we have he had a great deal of experience, which is another independent clause. So a comma is not enough to separate these two independent clauses. How can we fix it? The same way we would fix any other run-on. Here I've chosen a semicolon. Michael Smith was the pilot, semicolon, he had a great deal of experience. So a comma does not have the same weight as a period, but a semicolon does. They're just slightly different, but a comma is completely different. Another common error of college students is having a fragment. Fragments are just incomplete sentences. So look at these two so-called sentences. The first one, many teachers were watching, period. And then this next one, because Krista McCullough would have been the first teacher in space, period. Well, notice we have a subordinating conjunction, because. And even though, logically, this phrase or this clause comes after an independent clause, it doesn't stand by itself. It makes sense right after it, but grammatically, it is not good. So readers might be able to understand this, but teachers really don't like it. And actually, it is better writing to fix it. So the fragment here is because Krista McCullough would have been the first teacher in space. You do not want to have that by itself. And this is the most common kind of fragment, using the word because after a period and then not having an independent clause come after it. So what do? You can connect the fragment to the independent clause before it or after it, and here it matches with the independent clause before it, with no comma because of the rule we learned previously. Subject-verb, subordinating conjunction, subject-verb, period. Many teachers were watching because Krista McCullough would have been the first teacher in space. Don't put a comma. If you flipped the sentence, you could put a comma. Because Krista McCullough would have been the first teacher in space, comma, many teachers were watching, period. That is an option. You can also change a fragment to an independent clause so that it makes sense. Here we have another sentence with a fragment after it. Krista McCullough was from New Hampshire. That is a simple sentence. And then we have a state on the East Coast. Yes, logically we understand what this means, but it is hard when you have a fragment to know whether it belongs to the sentence before it or the sentence after it. And here, obviously, there isn't even a verb. So we need to turn it into an independent clause or do something to fix it as a fragment. So here is an option. You can turn it into its own sentence. Krista McCullough was from New Hampshire. New Hampshire is a state on the East Coast, and that's perfectly fine to do. So there are other kinds of punctuation. Let's start with the basic punctuation, a period. A period indicates a full stop at the end of a sentence. So President Reagan said, "This is truly a national loss." Period. We don't have a comma after that. It's also used at the end of an abbreviation. So he mentions Nancy, and Nancy was Mrs. Reagan's first name. So we have the word Mrs., and it's abbreviated MRS, period. So that period is used in many abbreviations. Next we have commas. Remember, commas are not like periods. They're different. Commas can separate items in a series. Notice this sentence. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, Christy McCullough. So even without the word 7, we can tell that there are 7 separate individuals being mourned. And between their names we see commas. Michael Smith, comma, Dick Scobie, comma, Judith Resnick, comma, and so forth. That's because we need to know where one person's name ends and another begins. And this could be for anything in a series or a list, not just people's names. Commas separate independent clauses connected by a coordinating conjunction, and we've already talked about that. Here's an example again. I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union, comma, but the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Again, those are 2 independent clauses separated by the coordinating conjunction but, and there is a comma before the coordinating conjunction. Commas have many uses. They can also separate phrases or dependent clauses before independent clauses, and we've talked about that as well. So here we have our prepositional phrase at the beginning of the sentence. For 25 years, comma, the United States space program has been doing just that. That comma makes it much easier to read. And again, if we have a complex sentence with the dependent clause at the beginning of the sentence, we need a comma. After the spacecraft lifted off, comma, a failure caused it to disintegrate. Commas also set off non-restrictive elements. So here's an example. We have our sentence, Krista McCullough, a high school teacher, was from New Hampshire. This sentence really just means Krista McCullough was from New Hampshire. And we have the extra information that is non-restrictive. It's just explaining who Krista McCullough was. And that is set off by commas. Krista McCullough, comma, a high school teacher, comma. You do not want to take those commas out. And a sentence is also used to set off direct quotes. Now notice this first sentence. This is not a direct quote. It is an indirect quote. A historian said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. That really just means a historian said that he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. We can take the word that out of the sentence. So whichever way I say this, I'm just mentioning what the person said. It may not be a direct quote. I may be paraphrasing what the person said. But if I want to quote the person directly, then I need quotation marks and a comma after the word said. Here's the same sentence, and this is a direct quote. A historian said, comma, quote, he lived by the sea, comma, died on it, comma, and was buried in it, period, end quote. So in this direct quote, we have said, which is the reporting word, and then a comma, and then the quotation mark. The other commas in this sentence are because we have different verbs that are a list. Lived, died, and was buried. So those are supposed to be there. And you cannot leave out the comma after said if you're using the quotation marks. And of course, you need quotation marks at the end. And now we come to my favorite punctuation, the semicolon. The semicolon separates 2 independent clauses with related information. So we've already talked about that, but let's look at another sentence. The others were NASA astronauts. Christy McCullough was a high school teacher. I could separate these with a period, but these 2 sentences are very closely related. I'm talking about what 6 people were and what the 7th person was. So I choose to put a semicolon here. The others were NASA astronauts, semicolon, Christy McCullough was a high school teacher, period. A semicolon also separates 2 independent clauses that are connected by an adverbial conjunction or a transition. That sounds really fancy. Maybe it's easier if we just look at an example. It's hard to understand, semicolon, however, comma, sometimes painful things like this happen. Now, the word however is not a subordinating conjunction. It's not a coordinating conjunction. It's something called a transition. And so we could put a period here, But in front of some of those words like however, also, furthermore, sometimes it's better to put a semicolon. So we have the subject and verb it's, and then we have semicolon and things happen. We're just adding the transition however with a comma. So it reads, it's hard to understand, semicolon, however, comma, sometimes painful things like this happen. And then here is the less common usage, but still important usage of a semicolon. It separates items in a list whose items contain commas. Okay, now we have our list of 7 heroes, but we have added information. Remember, we mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, the pilot; Dick Scobie, the commander; Judith Resnick, an electrical engineer; Ronald McNair, a physicist; Ellison Onizuka, an engineer; Gregory Jarvis, a payload specialist; and Krista McCullough, a high school teacher. Now, if you did not have the semicolons, it would look like there are 14 people being mentioned, possibly. Michael Smith, number 1, the pilot, number 2, but that's very confusing. So we have to keep Michael Smith together with his description, which is also an appositive, the pilot. So that is one set, Michael Smith, comma, the pilot. Because we need that comma before the pilot, we don't want to get confused and put another comma afterwards. We want to set off the next person, Dick Scobie, comma, the commander. And then the next person is Judith Resnick, comma, an electrical engineer. So that semicolon separates the people in a list, which we would only do if those people or whatever else I'm listing has a comma within its phrase. Okay? So Gregory Jarvis, a payload specialist, that has a comma, so I need a semicolon. If I didn't have a comma there, I would just need another comma. And we also have what's called a colon, or what some people call the 2 little dots. A colon introduces information in a list. So we've seen a similar sentence before. Here we have, we mourn 7 heroes, colon, and then we have the list of the people. So notice that everything to the left of the colon, those 2 little dots, is a complete sentence, and it must be a complete sentence. We mourn 7 heroes. And then you can have a list after a colon. So we have our list of 7 heroes. And it could be people, it could be objects, it could be a number of things. So whatever's on the right does not have to be a complete sentence, but whatever is on the left of the colon must be a complete sentence. A colon can also introduce an explanation of the first cause. So what does that mean? Let's look at this sentence. The cause of the disaster was found later. An O-ring seal had failed. So we have a colon, and this time we have a full sentence on both the left side of the colon and the right side. And that's because on the right side we don't have a list, we have an explanation of the cause. So we don't have to have the word cause in either part of the sentence. But this makes it rather clear. The cause of the disaster was found later. That's to the left of the colon, and that's a full sentence. And this time, after the colon, we also have a full sentence. An O-ring seal had failed, and that is the cause, that's the explanation of the cause. And then we have apostrophes. Apostrophes have 2 main functions. The first function is to indicate an omission in contracted forms. So with words like can't, won't, I'll. Here we have the sentence, we're thinking about you so very much. So we're is spelled W-E apostrophe R-E with no extra spaces before or after the apostrophe. So the apostrophe takes the place of what is taken out or omitted. We're really means we are. Notice that we have the W, the E, and then the RE. What we don't have is the A, and that's where the apostrophe goes. Again, there's no space when you use a contraction. An apostrophe also shows possession. Here we have Nancy was Mrs. Reagan's first name. So Mrs. Reagan is the president of Ronald Reagan, and her first name was Nancy. So the name belongs to Mrs. Reagan. So we have an apostrophe S, Mrs. Reagan's first name. And we have quotation marks. Quotation marks indicate the beginning and end of a direct quote. Look at this sentence. Ronald Reagan said, "The future doesn't belong to the light-hearted. It belongs to the brave." Notice that after the word said, I have a comma, and then because this is actually what he said, I have quotation marks. At the beginning, the future doesn't belong, and then at the end, to the brave, period, end quotation marks. Notice that these two sets of quotation marks look different. The first set seemed to be pointing down. The second set seemed to be pointing up, kind of like two commas. You don't have to do anything special on your computer for this. All you need to do is make sure that you have a space before beginning quotation marks. So if you write said, comma, space, and then hit the quotation mark key, you will get the opening quotation marks. Make sure you don't have a space after them. And then for the ending quotation mark, you have a period and quotation marks. Regardless of what comes before the end quotation mark, you do not have a space. You should just put the quotation mark after the last character. And in this case, that's the period. And then a space comes after the quotation marks. This way, your computer will automatically use the closing quotation marks that you see there. Quotation marks also indicate the title of a short work. Look at this sentence. Michael Hersley wrote the article, "The Space Shuttle Explodes," on the day after the disaster. So the name of his article is "The Space Shuttle Explodes." That is an article, so it's probably just a few pages. So that is in quotation marks. Again, notice that because I did the correct spacing, the computer did the opening and closing quotation marks for me. Notice this sentence. Alan MacDonald wrote the book Truth, Lies, and O-Rings in 2012. That's a book that's also about the Challenger space shuttle disaster. However, because this is a book, the title is in italics, Truth, Lies, and O-Rings, not in quotation marks because this is a much longer work. Thank you for listening. Period.